Welcome to the Corpse Club, the official podcast of DailyDead.com. I am one of your co-hosts, Derek Anderson, and I'm joined today by Daily Dead senior columnist Scott Drebit and Daily Dead columnist Bryan Christopher. Thanks for joining me, gentlemen.
As always,
a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. I said it first. Shut up.
Pleasure.
Dibs. Well, what if I told you guys that on today's episode of Corpse Club, we are going to be talking about some of the great what ifs of horror history? Would you be shocked?
For that.
It is kind of one of those things where when you talk about horror as storied as the horror genre is, and as how many amazing movies and properties and performances there are, for every great movie, there seems to be a great what if. For like, what if this movie gone this direction? What if this character had been played by this person? I mean, it's an infinite list all its own. And it kind of reminds me of the like what if Marvel comic book series, where they actually did kind of live out some of these fantasies of what if this character had been evil and that kind of thing. So we thought it'd be
like what if the Hulk became a shoe salesman?
Exactly.
Stuff like that. I love those.
I hear there's only like 4 copies of that left in existence. It's a pretty choice find if you can pick it up.
Yes. The rest were burned.
They were buried in the ET Atari cartridges.
That's right. Not the best product.
You can go dig them up and make your own horror movie there. So we're going to go back and kind of go around round robin style. We love, we've had a lot of fun doing this with our Easter egg horror episode. We've done this where when we look back at specific years in horror and each talk about a movie. So we thought it'd be kind of fun to do kind of another list episode. And this is our first installment of what might be a recurring theme for us if all goes well. So maybe Scott, if you want to kick us off with your first what if. When you look back at the horror genre, is there any what ifs that you've always thought about, or at least would find interesting when it comes to anything that you can think of?
Well, no pressure there at all, and I hope it's acceptable.
Okay, we'll be the judge of that, and our listeners.
Here we go. All right. What if
I like that intro.
It really was Michael under the mask at the end of H2O?
Life would be a lot better.
And that's why I came up with that question. That is the correct answer, Bryan.
Oh, now
there would be no resurrection. This is definitely a baby Hitler moment for me. I would definitely offer that so that we didn't have to endure resurrection.
So wait, you would go back and kill baby Hitler so that Halloween Resurrection never came out?
I thought that was clear.
But you do realize by saying this that no resurrection means no dangertainment, right? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I'm fully aware. Yeah.
And we should, I'll let our listeners know we may be getting into some spoilers on this episode, but as you mentioned, as we found out in Resurrection, the person under that Michael Myers mask that Laurie Strode chops off is in fact a paramedic who's had his vocal cords crushed. So when you guys saw Halloween H2O for the first time, did you have any idea that wasn't the case, or did you think it was actually Michael under there?
No, I thought it was him. Got him,
and it was perfect.
In the most definitive way.
The movie, that made that movie, and erase that at the end was just black.
Yeah,
I could.
Yeah. No, I thought it was. I was positive it was him. And that was that.
But so playing out the fun things about those old what if comics was, the ripple effect of that one little change. And so if H2O ends definitively, they don't come out with Resurrection that kind of tanks. Is there a Rob Zombie remake? And then later down the line, is there Halloween 2018? Like, do those movies still get made in this? What if universe?
Yeah, because I don't even think Resurrection comes on the old Ripple radar. If that's such a thing, I don't know. Right? There's nothing in Resurrection.
You don't need Resurrection to get to to Rob Zombie's stuff.
There's nothing in Resurrection that connects it whatsoever. So if I can make this happen, that's my big what if world.
I feel like even without Resurrection, they might have done maybe they would have done like a reboot before or a remake before Rob Zombie, because I feel like they wanted to get another movie out because of, just getting that box office haul. So, but maybe they go in an entirely different direction with it and they say, okay, we're just going to start from scratch. And then maybe it ends up being someone other than Rob Zombie who does like the first new installment.
I mean, looking back on it, I mean, it's so, we just become so cynical, but yeah, of course it's going to be they're going to come up with some excuse or reason, and you have your next installment, and you wouldn't feel so bummed about it if it wasn't, Jamie Lee Curtis coming back to the series to, put it to bed. But they knew when they were making it that there was going to be how it was in Resurrection.
So yeah, I remember us talking about this in a previous episode that like the rumor is that like it wasn't a retcon, that they had written it that way all along.
Yeah.
That hurts.
Well, I know that there was definitely pushback on killing Michael Myers. Like the producers did not want that to happen. And I don't even know if it was even allowed to happen. Like if that was, but so I think insider knowledge, yeah, they knew that they had to do something, but I almost want, it's such like a corner to paint yourself in, that final shot where it's like, how are you going to get past this? And Kevin Williamson from Scream comes in and kind of comes up with this whole like situation with the paramedic. And it's pretty out there. So it's kind of wild that they like, if they knew that they needed to still do another one, that they still let them end it in such a final way.
I'll be honest though, I live in the what if universe. Like the ending to H2O, I don't care if they had meant to write it that it was the paramedic. I see that as Michael Myers died and she killed him, and it's the perfect ending to that movie, which was decent right up until then and was awesome because of that ending. And yeah, it's a satisfactory ending to that particular, I guess, parallel universe of the Halloween universe. So, now that we've got three trajectories, we've got the Jamie trajectory through 4 and 5. We've got the H2O trajectory, and now we've got this new trilogy where it's, who knows where that's going to go? Like, who knows if Halloween Kills this is going to wind up doing like the resurrection thing too. We'll see.
Well, this series is already a what if.
It really is.
Yeah, just a series of what ifs.
Yeah. And then you have Halloween 6, which is kind of this bridge between things, but it's also very much its own thing.
What if it was all a cult?
Right. Well, you got to get creative, I suppose, the farther along you go. What if it was all a plan to kill all the children of the world for no real concrete reason?
As a goof.
Now that you mention it, maybe Halloween 6 isn't the most, or Resurrection isn't the most bizarre one now that you mention it. Well, on that note, now that Scott has kicked us off, let's go to Brian. What are you thinking for pick number 1 here?
All right, so we all know that the Cursed film series has come out on Shudder, where they talk about a series of movies that are said to have been plagued with, unfortunate happenstance, tragedies, things like that. And I'm working my way through the series, but I'm kind of circling The Crow because I don't know if I'm ready to deal with the emotions that are going to bubble up from watching that one. I am 100% like that movie's audience. I was 10 years old when it came out. I have always had there's always been that little goth kid that's been inside me itching to get out. So when movies like that come out, I glom onto them. But one of the things I've always thought about would be, what if Brandon Lee was not killed on the set on production while filming The Crow. As most people know, in the production, there was an issue with one of the prop guns. They were using what were called dummy cartridges before. Basically, it's the bullet but no powder in it. So it looks like if you have like a shot of the gun from the front of it, it needs to look like there's a bullet in it. And if it's a blank, that bullet casing isn't there, so it doesn't look real. And so they were using that for a scene. I heard something along the lines of, like, if I read it correctly, they were messing around with it. And then when they put the blanks in, they didn't know that there was still a dummy cartridge like in the barrel of the gun. So when they did the scene where Eric Draven first gets murdered, there was a dummy cartridge. So when they shot the blank, the combination of there actually being gunpowder in the blank and there being a cartridge in the chamber fired off and wound up killing Brandon Lee. So what if that dummy cartridge wasn't in there and he, survived and went on to continue to have a career after that? Kind of the two things that come to mind for me with that are, what does that do to the movie? In terms of, I think it's a very beautiful movie. It's a really well done movie. I know there are some people who thinks it's like way over the top in terms of like the gothy noir mid 90s kind of aesthetic to it. I love it, but I also recognize that like there's that bittersweet element of knowing that he died during filming that adds an extra layer of kind of like feeling and tragedy to it. So the question for me becomes like, does the movie become less impactful without that kind of part of the backstory? And I guess that's the first what if question for this I would put to the group.
Well, that's some heavy shit, man. I think right off the bat that this is more of a I wish than a what if. I think we all wish that he was still with us. I think the film may have gotten less attention initially if he hadn't passed, but I think its impact would still be there, and that's mostly because of him. When that happened, it really was. It wasn't a sympathy comfort that we were giving towards him. He really was talented. It wasn't a case of, this poor guy, he died during this production. He was good. This was he was the real deal. And the tragedy of it, I think, is that, we never got to see what he got to do after this. And I think that would be the most exciting thing about a what if with Brandon Lee is what would he have done beyond this, And
that was exactly going to be my second part of this what if was going to be like, what would the career trajectory of Brandon Lee after this look like? And I know that's wildly speculative, but yeah, that's the other thing I think of, like, what did we miss out on? I don't mean that to sound like crass or selfish in terms of like, oh, we missed some great movies because this guy died. More just like, I'm bummed for him because like I think this was going to be the thing that tipped him over, because before this he had done mainly like B action movies and was just kind of, I think, living quite a bit in the shadow of his father, Bruce Lee. But I think this was going to be the one where everybody would have gone like, oh man, this guy can act. So it would have been really interesting, and it would have been really cool to see like where that would have, what his trajectory would have been after this.
Yeah. And I think with his passing and watching the movie, you are, of course, because of the nature of what happened, you are naturally drawn to him and focused completely on him. I know I certainly was. But I think his performance, if he had lived, still would have got that attention because it's a real mesmerizing star making performance. It really is.
Yeah, it showed just that range that you're talking about. And I love like Showdown in Little Tokyo, but it's no The Crow. And it was such a showcase for him. And I think when like Heath Ledger passed away and he had played the Joker, I think there were definitely some similarities in those performances, not saying that they influence each other, but I'm just saying that's like the level of talent that I thought Brandon Lee brought to The Crow and that character. Like it just was such a great performance, and who knows like what he would have done after that. I mean, I think a lot of doors would have opened up for him. I think maybe the comic book adaptations would have taken off a little bit more if they could have done some more stuff with him in that franchise, or just showing that, hey, this works. But it's a really like a devastating what if, because obviously it's taken far too soon and just such a tragic accident. But it also, I think, did kind of create this cult focus on the film. But I think the film is so good that it would have held up regardless. And it would have been great, obviously, to just see where his career could have gone from there, because man, he really got into that role. I mean, that was, there was so much going on in that performance.
Well, you know what, no matter what the reviews were, and the reviews were varying,
right.
From effusive to, not so hot. The one common denominator was they all praised Brandon Lee's performance. And I don't think that was like I said, a sympathy tip of the hat. I think that was a genuine, he's really, really good in it.
Yeah. There would have been ways they could have like sidestepped that, and, they didn't, have to, crap on it, but they wouldn't have to have made such a point of saying, like, even if they didn't like the movie, they liked him in it. So yeah, I do think people did genuinely really like him, even if they didn't much like the movie. But yeah, I mean, and I apologize for kind of kicking off this what if banter with such a downer of a thing. It's honestly like
no, it's a celebration.
It was one of the first things that popped up, because it's one of the first things that popped into my head, because this is legitimately something I've thought about quite a bit, since seeing the movie. What is this, 26 years ago?
Yeah. Wow.
So a brief glimpse into my brain. This is the kind of stuff I think about.
Well, no, sure. And so much of these what ifs I think we're probably going to see are, like I said, they're essentially wish fulfillment, right? Mm-hmm. It's something that we would have liked to have seen happen for the betterment of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of wish fulfillment,
nice.
I think I'll take the baton. And Scott, you mentioned no Halloween Resurrection, but what if I said a sequel to Halloween Resurrection? No, I'm just kidding. But what if I told you there's a world where there's 5 different Halloween Resurrections? In all seriousness, though, I think for my first pick, I'm going to talk about something that actually the podcast Pod and the Pendulum is doing a live reading of this screenplay. And that is the George A. Romero's screenplay for Resident Evil, back when he was originally kind of lined up to direct it. And he had done that commercial for the Resident Evil 2 video game, and they were so impressed with that. It was such like a groundbreaking commercial that he got approached to kind of like put together a screenplay for the first Resident Evil movie back when they were kind of figuring out what direction they wanted to go. And there really was no, other than the video games, there was nothing really for him to go off of. So he could kind of create whatever he wanted based solely on the video games. And eventually he ends up leaving the project, but man, what if that would be? And I say this as someone who genuinely does enjoy the Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil movies, especially the first one. I think I really do like what he did with the first one, and I have Deadly Pleasures place in my heart for the sequels. So I've always liked that because it is so over the top and everything. But then I think I can't help but wonder like what a Resident Evil movie by George Romero would have looked like. I mean, that just seems, and I haven't.
Has anyone read the screenplay?
I haven't read the screenplay. I don't know if you guys have.
I haven't. Not, no.
And that would be good. That would have been good homework for me. But just the thought of him, just because even beyond what that movie looks like, does that affect what Romero does with his career? Do we ever see Land of the Dead? Like, what if it does so well that he ends up directing 3 Resident Evil movies and never does his second Living Dead trilogy? There's a lot of there's a lot of butterfly effects there.
I think the only thing I can picture is knowing Romero's sensibilities and the way he approaches plot and the things that he cares about when it comes to telling movies, especially when it comes to zombie movies. I would see Resident Evil video game fans going into this movie and just getting whiplash, and just not knowing which way is up, because I cannot picture Romero making something that looks anything like the Paul Anderson Paul Anderson, right?
Oh, WS. Yep.
Paul W.S. Anderson. I can't imagine them being anything alike. And, I just even remember like myself going into the original Dawn of the Dead for the first time. Like that was an acquired taste for me. Like the first time I saw it, I was like, what the hell am I watching? There's like calliope music going, and like someone just put a pie in one of the zombies' faces. Like, I'm not sure I'm getting this. But like upon subsequent viewings, it really just sank in, and you get what Romero is doing. So I'm wondering if those sensibilities fit in with the Resident Evil universe in a way that it would, audiences would appreciate it.
Who's to say, who's to say what kind of, we can, well, that's why we're here, Scott, you idiot, to speculate. I don't want to speculate on it. Next.
So your picks are all done now.
I'm trying to recall, but I think there was an article one time where I read that said, Jed, never mind that last one, that Romero, tongue got a little tied there, that Romero was staying true to the first game, if I'm correct. I think I heard something to that effect.
Which means it would have been a lot more like house stuff, I guess.
Yeah, you got the haunted mansion, or I guess it's haunted by zombies, but but yeah, you would have Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine.
It's a zombie movie, but it feels more like a haunted house movie than it does a zombie movie.
Right.
Yeah. If I remembered or misremembered that.
No, you're correct.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause he definitely was, he was very, he was doing a lot of research like on the game itself, the first game. And he was going to, I think, incorporate a lot of those characters. So it seemed like he was actually going to stay true to the game. What I'm wondering is, would it have still had that like high paced kind of frenetic action style of the Resident Evil movies that we got? And I just don't see that happening. Like I feel it maybe would have been more of like a slow burn, but who knows?
Until he brought in characters from his movie Night Riders, and a guy with a jousting spear on a motorcycle comes through and just stabs the zombie through the head.
Well, now I need to see that movie.
Perfect.
Right?
Exactly.
Bring Ed Harris back. You got yourself a franchise, my friend.
Just bring in the wheelbarrows of money. See, that would satisfy multiple fan bases too. But yeah,
none.
Yeah, well, there's that. But
yeah, it would either draw in or alienate everybody.
And it's funny too, because the whole character of Alice from the Resident Evil that we do get, she's kind of like her own thing. She's not, from these initial games. So it's kind of like maybe the diehard fans would have been more happy with Romero's direction instead of kind of Paul kind of sampling things from like all the different video games. But at that point, you also have more video games to sample from. So it's kind of, it's a what if that spawns like 10 other what ifs.
Now, if he makes the Resident Evils and they become successful, do you still get your Diary of the Dead?
See, that's the thing I don't want to risk, because That is my favorite.
Because that
George
came
Romero.
after Resident Evil, did it not?
It came out. Yeah. Oh yeah. Diary of the Dead came out like 2007 or 8ish. And it's like, right. I just love that movie so much. And I know not everybody does, but it's, I feel like that probably doesn't happen because I mean, that was made on such an independent scale that if Romero was raking in the big bucks, like, as we know, Resident Evil is a huge grossing franchise. I don't think he's going. I mean, who knows? Maybe he does. Maybe he still feels the need to kind of do more of a guerrilla style filmmaking thing. But I don't know if we would get Diary of the Dead. So maybe this isn't a universe I'd want to live in.
You know, I think he would probably be tired of no one giving him money or giving a shit. And I'd say he's on like Resident Evil 9 right now. And you know what? They're all pretty good.
Hey, there we go. Did we get that? We need to isolate that soundbite. Scott is showing praise for the Resident Evil franchise. Oh, boy.
Wait a second. Context.
You're like, wait, this is alternate universe Resident Evil. On that note,
care. He's going to snip it, and all you're going to hear tomorrow is how much Scott Drebit loves the entire Resident Evil series.
Some may call it clickbait, but I've got proof. Oh. Well, Scott, on that note, I think it's your turn again if you'd like to lead us into round number 2.
No problem. Have you guys seen a little movie called The Bride of Frankenstein?
Yes, I think I've heard of that one.
Okay.
Rings a bell.
All right. What if the bride actually loved the monster instead of rejecting him? Could they have settled down together? Maybe have some Franken kids?
See, that's a great question because it's a part of the theme of everything that makes Frankenstein interesting. Like from the book to the original movie to The Bride of Frankenstein, like if anyone along the way would have shown this monster genuine compassion, like, does it have hope? Can it be something other than a monster, or can it prove that being a monster doesn't need to be a bad thing? Or does that mean, in this case, does the what if end in now there's 2 monsters and they've essentially joined forces and they're going to waylay to the town they're in? What
I'm saying you could go lots of different ways with this, right?
That's a really interesting one.
I guess I would like to picture them as like the couple where it's like, leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. But if you go looking for trouble, you are going to find it.
You kids stay off the Frankenstein's property, okay?
Or they'll throw you into the lake.
It turns into like the Burbs or Monster Squad or something.
I don't care if he's got good crab apples. Stay out of his yard.
Yeah, I mean, it does make you wonder, like, a Franken family would have been kind of a cool way for them to spin off into.
Franken family.
Right? I mean, then you can broaden it to more of a family-friendly audience. You can do it kind of Munsters style. Right? Like, this isn't crazy. This seems to be potential here.
I mean, it robs, it robs the world of the Bride of Frankenstein that we know.
True.
But also Derek brings up a good point. What happens if the bride actually does fall in love with the monster? You get the series The Munsters. That's what happens.
I know. That's all I wanted to say, really, is I love the Munsters.
This conversation was already had in a conference room about 60, 70 years ago. And from that, we got...
What if they fall in love and give birth to a human and a wolf boy, and one of their parents is a vampire?
Doesn't sound like...
I always have my finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist, so...
It is kind of interesting how everything ended up there. But yeah,
I felt so bad for I just felt so bad for the guy.
Right.
I mean, she looks at him, she screams, points at him. Like, we've all been there.
We've all been there. Yeah.
We've all been there. It's not great.
Why are you hissing at me?
Yeah.
But I mean, the flip side of that too is like, imagine you're essentially, for all intents and purposes, being born, and the first thing you see is this like hulking mass drooling and like standing over you. I mean, it's not a great position for her to have to be in either.
Well, I would say, sister, take your ass to a mirror, because that's not true. She's actually really hot.
Yeah, she'd be a lot hotter if she smiled too, right, Scott? Jeez, this guy.
What?
I don't know.
What the hell?
There is it's funny because someone was just writing about, because it just celebrated its 85th anniversary, and people were talking about, is this like the greatest sequel ever, or like just the movie itself and how much of it is a masterpiece. And if you take away that downer ending, is it still have that reputation? I don't know.
And what is with us, like collectively, especially horror fans, where it's these movies wouldn't be nearly as good without the downer endings. Like, we keep coming back to that. Like, kind of with the Brandon Lee thing, like, would it be as good if he didn't die during it? I know we've had conversations about Night of the Living Dead would be as good as, if Ben didn't die in the end. Like, we love us some dark endings in terms of giving something a little extra oomph. Why is that?
That's a good point. I mean, because I think there's a lot of us that don't need that.
And I think you're just, in your general movie going experience, you expect the upbeat ending. That's, mostly what you're raised on at the movies is the upbeat ending. That's Hollywood. That's the way it's done. So, when you when you get that downer ending, it always hits because you're not expecting it.
Yeah.
And that's why it was almost unexpected when Get Out when Jordan Peele went the direction he did with Get Out, because we know there's that alternate ending that's a much more of a downer, but also like would have been quite a gut punch to end the movie on. But it's almost like you're relieved that he didn't, because you're like, oh, please just let's have somewhat of a happy ending here where we can just go off in the sunset. Even though it's super timely and like it would have been quite a statement to do that, it's almost like, oh, thank God, we can leave the theater feeling a little bit better that he went this direction
would have
instead.
Been super pissed.
Right.
And it's almost because, like, like you were talking about, Scott, like especially with the horror genre, like what it usually brings to the table is it goes down roads that other genres usually aren't willing to go down. And so, most genres will go with a happy ending at the end. Sorry. I didn't mean for that to come out the way it did. They will go for an ending that people will enjoy at the end. But horror is willing to go there when it comes to stories. Don't always have a happy ending. But I think in the Get Out example, that almost would have been too obvious, because everybody was expecting it to go that way. To take that last minute swerve was actually doing what the audience wasn't expecting. So I think that's why it worked there so well.
Like almost like reverse psychology. Like, you think this is going to happen. Yeah. I'm going to make you think it's going to happen.
Reverse gut punch, if you will. Yeah.
Yes. It sounds like a wrestling move. A reverse twist ender.
Reverse gut punch sounds more pleasant than a gut punch.
So all that
That's
to say,
just me.
All that to say, if the Bride of Frankenstein had fallen in love with Frankenstein, they would have enjoyed Get Out. Is my final thesis.
I'm sure that's what Scott was getting at.
All my homework, because that's as concise as it can be put.
And on that note, let's go to the professor. Brian, what's your second pick?
Professor
Dickwad tonight. Oh man. So I am going to go with back to Scott and mine's favorite franchise, and I'm going to ask, what if Phantasm 2 had been a huge hit for Universal, and they continued financing sequels of that franchise. Because we know how things went with the first one, obviously super independent, made with Coscarelli's money and I think primarily his parents' money. And then Universal, 10 years later, gives him, I think it was a $3 million budget to do Phantasm 2. And most Phantasm fans know that there is it's still a Phantasm movie, but it has very different sensibilities than what came before and I think what came after it. And so I think what we get that comes after it is still like the Phantasm franchise for me is probably my favorite of all time, but that's in spite of in 3, 4, and 5, there's a huge dip in budget, and there are definitely some seams that show there. And so I wonder what the trade-off would be, to what degree Coscarelli would be able to maintain any kind of creative control with having more money, or are we better off with him having been able to play out the plot the way he wanted to and just have to do it in a way that wasn't quite as polished as it might have been otherwise?
Was 3 not financed by MCA Universal?
I don't recall. I mean, if it was a lot less. 3 and 4 were back to back in direct video. So regardless who
the point still stands. The budgets
was at a lot less than.
It didn't get the bells and whistles that it got on the second one.
Exactly.
Well, and two
with
really
Universal
didn't have all that many bells and whistles, but it had been so long since Phantasm that it seems like it. I mean, a $3 million budget is what, craft services for the movie, right? I mean, like even in 1988,
Mm-hmm.
So it just naturally has that bigger look. I think part of the charm of, for instance, Oblivion is that it's a more intimate film. And I don't know if that one I would like to see. I don't think that one needs more money, to be honest. But 3, which was made for more money than 4, but less than 2, that one is more effects driven and action driven, and it looks like a much more expensive movie than it is already. But if he could have been given some more money on that one just to kind of play around even more, that would have been cool.
And shockingly, I'm looking at this, and the budget wasn't that much less. It was $2.5 million. But I guess at the same time, it is also 10 years later that they're getting that. So, this was 94. So 6 years later. So $2.5 million is going even less than, 3 would have in 88. But yeah, I mean, it's for me, I don't see the big drop off until 4 and 5 in terms of, again, not necessarily the plot or the narrative, but in terms of the look, you can definitely kind of see the strain in terms of the ideas matching the ability to execute them in 4 and definitely in 5. 3 is not quite as bad, but it's tough because I also don't know if the movies if he was given more money, would the movie still be?
Do you lose that charm?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the creative control too, because we have, James LaGrosse replacing A. Michael Baldwin as Mike in 2, and that's like direct studio interference. So then do we see that continue?
In this what if it makes money, part of they're going to see what made money was making that casting change. So A. Michael Baldwin probably never comes back to play Mike again.
Or why don't we do another what if on this and say that James LaGrosse doesn't get the role, but Michael Baldwin does? Does that make Phantasm 2 a better movie? Yes, I think it would.
And especially like with the diehard fans maybe rallying around it more and it not being like such a...
Nothing wrong with James LaGrosse. He's a fine actor. I've seen him in a lot of really good things. He's a great actor.
He's great in Near Dark. He's great in Point Break.
But he ain't Mike.
Right. Well, and especially, yeah.
Well, it's the frustrating thing about the series because everything else is so controlled and within and in Coscarelli's grasp, right? And there's just that one thing in the one movie that he couldn't control.
Yeah, it's not like Friday the 13th where he had 3 different Tommy Jarvises. It's
the only anomaly in the Phantasm series. It's the only asterisk.
Yeah,
it's literally his
in the history book, right?
That's his what if scenario. Like that's his what if alternate universe. In part 2, Mike is this completely different dude. What if Mike was, a different man than what he is in 1, 3, 4, and 5?
That is amazing. And it's amazing too that so much time went in between the first one and the second one that they actually still sequelized it and didn't like make Coscarelli like just reboot it or something and like cast with an entirely different cast. It's like, no, this is actually the same. It's just continuing that story and everybody is being played by the same people except for the main character, which is like so almost disorienting as a fan where you're like, wait a minute.
Hey, did we miss something? Can I side diff?
Go for it. We'll allow it.
What if Coscarelli got to make Phantasm's End written by Roger Avery?
That because that had like a whole more like the world end of the world apocalyptic kind of a narrative to it, right?
Yeah,
so a very massive scale. Like, I mean,
possibly
then you really need that budget
Campbell
too.
In one of the roles. Yeah, they
who
weren't
in one of the roles?
for all that much either. I mean, I forget what the figure was, but it was still like, come on, really?
See, I was excited for that because I was definitely like reading the news about it and hoping that would have come to fruition. But I love Ravager. I love what they did with that idea of having those kind of dual narratives with the actual, or I can't say actual because it's kind of whichever path you want to believe is real. But there's the quote unquote real world where Reggie is kind of succumbing to dementia and dying. And then there's the maybe fantasy, maybe the actual real world where, everything with a tall man is real. And there's all that overlap. And there's just that sense of melancholy over the whole thing that I love that as an ending. Just kind of letting you, it's a true Phantasm movie because it doesn't give you any closure, but it also gives you a way of however you want to interpret it, you can kind of make your own closure about it. And so I don't know that Phantasm's End would have given you that kind of level of nuance that Ravager gives.
Well, I read the script, the Phantasm's End script, and it's a good movie, but I'm not 100% sure it's a great Phantasm movie. It's a good post-apocalyptic movie, but they could have used a lot more Mike. It does have a fantastic ending. That's really good and in keeping with like some of the great Phantasm endings that we've got, even though they're essentially identical, but still it's like that kind of writ large, and it plays really well. But I think we're good with what we got in the Phantasm world, even with the what ifs.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I think I think we can be satisfied with what we got and cherish that. And we'll go to me for my second pick. I'm going to take us out of the Phantasm franchise and into the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which I think is full of many what ifs. The one I'm going to zero in on is or as Scott, you would say, what if Peter Jackson had directed a Nightmare on Elm Street 6, The Dream Lover, which he had been working on. I mean, after Dream Child, the franchise is kind of at this uncertain point. Where do we go from here? There's been a lot of documentation on all these different pitches that came in, and they were kind of New Line Cinema was mulling over a lot of different options on different directors and everything that they could have done before settling on Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. But one of the people involved in this whole process of, potentially bringing their movie to life was Peter Jackson, pre Lord of the Rings, of course, post Bad Taste. And he had this idea to do a Freddy movie, and it would have been called The Dream Lover, and it would have kind of like it's like a fascinating idea that like people would have been in, like they would have been wanting to go into the dream world, and just had like this whole thing about almost like Freddy losing control in a way. Because these kids don't even think Freddy's like that bad anymore. It's almost like he's not the big bad boogeyman anymore. People are using his dream world as a playground. And I don't know if I necessarily like the plot itself is interesting, but I think the biggest thing I wonder is like, what would that have looked like visually, like Peter Jackson doing a Nightmare on Elm Street movie? Because I feel like that would have been so fascinating to see, because he obviously could do so much with so little, just based on what he did in his first couple of films. And he's done Dead Alive. Like, what would that have looked like? I mean, that would have been so interesting. And who knows like where the franchise would go after that. If we instead of doing Freddy's Dead, we do Peter Jackson's Dream Lover, does the franchise like just continue throughout the 90s and we get many more Freddy movies, or does it just kind of fizzle out for a little bit anyway? That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm wondering.
Well, who's to say if Jackson's vision would have taken off with, a general audience? Yeah, it would have worked for the horror crowd, but Freddy always had the horror crowd plus, So, yeah. I mean, but I've dreamt about that movie many times. Like you said, he could do so much with so little, and had such an imagination that it almost blows my mind, like how cool this movie most likely would have been.
Yeah, I feel like it would have been some really interesting, like the kinetic energy of a Peter Jackson nightmare movie. Like when you think about his early stuff, his Bad Taste, and I Am Hitting a Bad Brain Cell. What's the one with the rat monkey?
Oh, Brain Dead or Dead Alive, depending on who you ask.
Alive, yes. Yeah. Like the kinetic movement of the camera throughout that movie, and just all the weird zooms and close-ups. It would almost be like Nightmare on Elm Street by way of like Evil Dead, just with how much motion there is in the way Peter Jackson shoots things. So I think it would have been an interesting direction to go down. I also wonder too, like, were they still? I'm trying to remember with the Dream Lover concept. Was that still a means to kill Freddy off? Like, was this still going to be like the final nightmare, and this was how they were going to get there, or was this just another open-ended sequel?
That I am not 100% sure of. I haven't read the script, but I know that it seems like it was kind of a transitional movie regardless, because of just how the dream world is perceived, how Freddy's kind of like on the defensive. It just seems like a natural transition for like a new, like maybe, Robert Englund hangs it up after another movie or two, and this kind of introduces a new, and I'm sure like maybe Peter Jackson could have created another type of like dream demon, because we saw him do so many things in Brain Dead that was like you mentioned with the monkey, but also the zombies and like the different types of zombies. So I'm sure like it would have been still a great way to like pass the torch, but instead of calling it Freddy's Dead and like being final, you can actually like kind of move on into the next. You can have a new beginning for a Nightmare movie. So.
Which is funny because like it is funny how a lot of these series are so afraid to commit to that. And I don't know if it was because of how people got so up in arms about it not being Jason in New Beginning, but you know, they threatened to do it at the end of Final Chapter with making Tommy Jarvis the killer. They threatened to do it at the end of Halloween 4 with making Jamie the killer. You know, they never seem to be quite willing to pull the trigger with letting the universe continue without its main kind of icon. And I do think we probably have a mixture of Halloween 3 and Friday 5 for that, where people just, you know, dismissed it outright just because it wasn't the character they had grown to love. Yeah. But that would be an interesting what if. Like, what if we got to explore the Nightmare on Elm Street universe beyond Freddy Krueger? Because as we see, like those dream demons, I don't think they were kind of a one and done thing. So it'd be interesting to kind of see how that plays out in other scenarios with other people.
Here's a what if, a present day what if. What if they made a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie, animated, and then Robert Englund could still do the voice?
That would be awesome.
I think it would need to, like, they would need to get a very specific animation style, and I'm picturing the animated sequences in Mandy. Like I would want 2D. Like I wouldn't want CGI. Like I wouldn't want a computer generated like a Pixar thing. I would want like a 2-dimensional animated movie, because I think that would be more ethereal and more in line with kind of the Nightmare mentality than doing something in CGI for some reason.
I want Disney. I want Disney in hell. That's what I want.
Ooh, yes. So instead of Jason Goes to Hell, we have Freddy Goes to Hell.
Sure.
I like this. Well, let's. There's enough streaming services. I think we can get somebody to pick this up.
I want executive producer credit, created by credit.
We'll put your name on the song lyrics author list there, Scott.
Nice.
And yeah, it's a what if that I think a lot of people wonder, because we went so long in between Freddy movies, between the Final Nightmare and then going into like Freddy versus Jason years later. So it is kind of I think at the very least, maybe it would have been best for the franchise. Who knows? But then again, when Peter Jackson blows up, so, you know, a few years, or I'm sorry, New Nightmare after Final Nightmare, then Freddy versus Jason, but Craven also doing his own thing with that one. And who know? And actually, we're kind of lucky to have gotten that one too. So maybe we don't get New Nightmare if Jackson like kicks off a new kind of phase of the Nightmare universe. So maybe it is kind of, and you know, New Nightmare was, I think, getting more appreciation now. So maybe it is kind of a good thing that we don't live in that universe. But it's maddening when you go down the circle and you think of all the different what ifs, because everything leads to something else. And speaking of going around, maybe one more time, I think we have time for one more round. Scott, if you want to kick us off on round 3.
Well, a perfect segue. What if Shocker had been a success? How many more would Craven have made? And would that mean that we get no Scream series of movies?
Oh my gosh. Man. You know, that's a tough one.
Yeah. And that's one that, my latest Let's Scare Brian to Death was with Ashley Blackwell, and we talked about Shocker. And a big part of that was like Wes Craven is so good at making movies, but I think so bad at setting himself up for a franchise, because a couple of reasons. I mean, he makes some really dark stuff. And especially when he was doing this in the late 80s, people were really more like, Freddy had become basically a Saturday morning cartoon by that point. And so to kind of bring in this much darker, brutal killer in Horace Pinker, you're probably not bringing the audience what they want out of a franchise killer anymore. And the other thing that he tends to do is he concludes his movies in a way that's usually not open-ended, especially if he has his own druthers, because like even with Nightmare on Elm Street, if he had gotten his way, that whole stinger at the end with, Joyce getting pulled through the window, or, the possibility that he's still around, he didn't have that in his original one. It was just over, and that's kind of what you get here too. He makes a pretty definitive ending to the movie. So it's hard to think of a what if where Shocker is successful.
But you know what? Sorry, go ahead.
I just wonder, like, where would he go from here, other than like maybe it's, does he come back around and start going after Jonathan again? Does he move on and try and move on elsewhere and start terrorizing other people? I'm just I'd be having a hard time wrapping my mind around like what would additional installments of that look like.
And it's a character.
But I can see why Craven thought it may work again, because the original Freddy was super frightening as well. And that became a huge success. So I think maybe he was thinking, you know what, I can still do this darker material but make it commercial enough so it'll play. Kind of, he was trying to replicate that Freddy formula, I guess, commercially. Why didn't it work? Hey, who knows? I mean, it's certainly no Nightmare on Elm Street, I don't think. And Horace certainly didn't become iconic, but I think there are possibilities there, and he was really good at mythology. So I think he really could have done some interesting things with Pinker had the series gone on.
And I think part of why Shocker would prove difficult for a franchise. Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger are so singularly focused. It's this guy, when you fall asleep, he attacks you in your dreams, he kills you, kind of rinse and repeat. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in terms of like, it's fairly straightforward. Shocker, there's so many different elements thrown into this. There's the electricity element. There's body hopping. There's haunting from dead girlfriends. There's literally getting into television. So I think there's so many different things. I think one of the things he might need to do, he might have needed to have done in order to make that kind of a franchise, is to kind of decide what path do we really want to explore with that, because he was throwing so much at the wall in Shocker. I think that's probably part of what the other thing that might have held it back from catching on as something that could have been more of a franchise. But if he maybe went down one of those paths and said, okay, for future installments, we're going to kind of stick to this element of it, maybe that would have been a way to go.
Especially when you have technology, that aspect of it, and you have computers becoming more popular, like throughout the 90s, that would have been really interesting. Like, I think there's at least another movie or two in there. And I know, like in your column, Bryan, that you were both talking about like how, Craven wanted to create kind of the next Krueger and kind of have the ownership of that character and really like steer that character down the direction he wants them to go. That would have been really interesting. Like, it's kind of a shame really that they didn't at least get to do one more just to see like what that would have looked like. Because I feel like not enough people even know about this movie in general.
Now, the ripple effect, as I mentioned in the What If, what happens to the Scream franchise? Do we get Scream?
Oh, don't you do this to me, Scott. Don't you make me. Well, I will choose Scream because it's closer to my heart.
Scream, do we get New Nightmare? Because I don't know that we get Scream, because if he gets a franchise out of Shocker, he probably doesn't feel the need to come back to do New Nightmare. And New Nightmare is essentially the blueprint for him to do the Scream. It's kind of the prototype in terms of the meta horror movie. So yeah, I don't, if he gets the success he wants out of Shocker and turns it into a franchise, I think that comes at the cost of Scream.
Ooh, that is problematic. If Shocker had been made maybe more mid 80s and we had a little more time to breathe in between these films, I think I'd be more comfortable. But Craven did obviously some of his best work in the 90s. So maybe it was good that Shocker kind of didn't do so hot at the box office, or at least wasn't received well enough to kind of create that next iconic character. Wow.
Yeah, I think Scream is essential to his filmography because it really did have a lot of people reassess him as a director.
Well, I mean, do you think it's at the point where, like, with kind of more and more younger people being at the forefront of horror fandom, do you think more people know about Wes Craven because of Scream than they do at Nightmare? Or do you think that's never going to be something where, do you think he's always going to be synonymous with the Nightmare franchise first and then Scream maybe as like a close second?
I think it's a generational thing. I think for a certain group of people, probably Derek, Sir Young Derek there, that would associate more with the Scream franchise than the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise.
Well, Scott, he's right here. Let's ask him.
No.
I'm actually, for me, it's Cursed.
This is a Cursed. Yeah, no, we shouldn't have let him talk.
No,
your instincts were correct, Scott.
It is Scream. I mean, even though, Scream obviously was such a 90s thing, and then it carried over in the 2000s, and it just seemed like Scream was like the Halloween costume. Like, I remember growing up, the most popular Halloween costume to have was Ghostface with the blood mask. And if you had that, you were like the coolest kid. You were the coolest wolf on the block. And that was no joke. I mean, you could have the regular one and it was pretty awesome. But if you had the blood mask, it was so cool. And then they just played those movies throughout the 2000s on TV a lot. So it just felt like there was even more of them than there were. And so, yeah, I definitely associate him with that. And because I watched those movies before I was just exposed to those movies like really before the first Nightmare on Elm Street. So it was kind of like a reverse kind of thing. So I guess it's good that Craven was able to, not only do that for himself, but also Scream ends up reinvigorating the whole like slasher genre for like the late 90s.
Movies, period.
Yeah, that's very true.
Movies, period.
That's very true.
Scream really reignited horror at the box office, and we started getting a lot more quantity of movies, not always necessarily more quality, but we started getting more movies theatrically again, which was hats off to him. I wouldn't want to lose the Scream franchise either, for the record, over Further Adventures of Horace Pinker, because I adore the Scream franchise.
But if there is a sequel, I think it really should be called The Further Adventures of Horace Pinker, because it sounds like a delightful children's book.
It does, doesn't it?
And on that note, Brian, let's go to you for your third pick. What do you have cooking in the kitchen?
Well, you mentioned food, so I'm going to actually, this is a callback to our Easter egg episode. I'm making some very tenuous connections.
Wow, no, I'm loving this.
I want to bring back up, we had talked about the Easter egg. It's more of a narrative Easter egg in The Thing, where we talked about if one of the characters had spoken Norwegian, they would have understood what the helicopter pilots was said, and this would have been a much shorter movie. And I actually don't know if that's the case. Because, and part of it is due to the literal line. I'm not going to try and say it in Norwegian because I'm just going to butcher it. I can't even say English words tonight, so I'm not going to bother with that. But the rough translation is, get the hell away. It's not a dog. It's some sort of thing. It's imitating a dog. It isn't real. Get away, you idiots. And so if you have, even if you understand Norwegian and someone is shouting that at you while firing a gun that actually, hits one of the people in your camp while trying to shoot a dog, there's a lot of different reasons why I don't know that would necessarily kind of nip that situation in the bud. So, if in this what if situation, if they speak Norwegian, what do you all think? Is this wrapped up a lot cleaner, or do we still get essentially the plot carry out? They just might know what's going on a little bit sooner.
Hold on. Brian, we have a first. We have a tag in what if.
Whoa.
Tag in what if.
I didn't even see this coming.
Let's have it.
What if it had been revealed definitively who the thing was? If either of them, would it have played better, worse, or the same?
So you mean what, at the end when
yes.
It's McCready and Childs, and
yes.
we're wondering? Worse. I like the idea that you don't know.
Me too. The ambiguity, I think, works in that case.
Yeah, because it's a dark ending, but it's not necessarily a completely bleak ending. There's still some ambiguity. There's still stuff to kind of keep your mind occupied, other than the fact that it's like, oh, this sucks.
And really, in the case of the thing, I mean, ambiguity is the name of the game, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's staying true to what's been established already, and it feels very Carpenter anyway to do that. So I like that.
All right, so let's go back to the first question in the what if then about
answer the last question first and the first question last.
That's right. There is no sanity clause. Okay. So in the first half of our question, really, it's kind of a reverse of the ending, isn't it? Because here we're giving more information if we did that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would it be in my scenario? It's a situation of, do we have this information in or not? I think this plays as more suspenseful, the way that we get it in the current version, without them knowing what the Norwegian is saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nor us, right? Mm-hmm. Nor us.
Very true.
But I think it's more important that the cast doesn't know, right? We can suss things out at our own pace, and we're going to. But I think it's important that they don't know. It just adds that extra layer of suspense, I think. So I think it should stay the way it is.
And like you said, Brian, like even if they understand the Norwegian, when you have someone who's shooting a gun in your direction and the dog itself looks fine, like you have no prior context to what they've just been through. You've never experienced any contact with alien life that you know of. Like you're just thinking this guy is drugged out of his mind. He's wasted. He's gone crazy. Something's gone wrong in this guy's head. And he's shooting at a dog. Like, what is the problem here? Like, I think it would almost still be a case of them almost maybe doing, like, even if they did know, like maybe they'd take a closer look at the dog, but I don't really think they would react differently necessarily, because from their point of view, it just looks like kind of what they think, that this person's gone crazy and they're just out of their minds, and we have to stop them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe it gets a little bit different, but maybe ultimately I think probably about the same thing happens, because the dog would probably hang out at their camp while they go and try and figure out, okay, what went wrong? And then maybe someone looks at the dog and gets infected. And then you still kind of have a similar outcome, unless someone is very like on edge or superstitious and just kind of totally buys into it right away. But I don't know if I would see that happening.
Well, and the other thing that, occurs to me too, is they do figure out that something is very wonky pretty early on. Like, not a lot of guys have died before they see all the havoc that's going on in the dog pen, where they know that this, isn't a regular dog that they're dealing with anymore, and it still manages to wipe out the whole camp. So it's almost more like, and this is, I guess, topical in a way that I wish we didn't have to be topical, but if you're looking at it with the current pandemic issue, like, the only way that this would have been nipped in the bud was if the guys in the helicopter were able to kill that wolf or that dog before it ever got there. They kind of can't protect themselves from it once it's there. So the only way to kind of sever and cut that cord is essentially what McCready does at the end. He knows, like, okay, we're not going to make it out of this, but we need to make sure it doesn't get to the mainland. Otherwise, they're all screwed. No matter if they know it or not, it's still probably going to be able to plow through the entire population. So I do think ultimately that in the what if scenario, like, they might get a little bit more of a head start on what's going on, but like, it wasn't too long before they realized anyway, and it still wiped them all out. So I still think it's nice because it adds an extra layer of suspense for us. And it's another funky layer for, like, when you find out, like, oh, you know what's going on early in the movie if you speak this language, but I don't think ultimately that stops what happens from happening.
Yeah. Unfortunately for them, I think I almost feel like it always just ends with Kurt Russell, Kurt Russell and, oh gosh, Keith David sitting across from each other, just because, like you say, you'd have to stop the camp from even getting infiltrated. And I just don't see that happening. I mean, I may be a little more suspicion, but it is crazy though that they actually put that out there so early in the movie. And like we had talked about on the Easter egg episode, like, if anyone watched that movie and they were Norwegian and they understood the language, it's such a, like, big tell, like, right away that it's hiding in plain sight, which is a bold move, but I think it worked. And with that, we'll swing it back to me for my third pick. I know I was kind of joking around with a fake out with Halloween Resurrection earlier, but I will take it back to the Halloween franchise for my final pick. But instead, we're going to go to another film in the franchise, and that is Halloween 5. So my question is, what if, and hear me out, Jamie Lloyd had become an evil killer in Halloween 5 after Halloween 4 ended with her stabbing her stepmother with a pair of scissors?
So I think for that to work, there would need to be a similar time jump as what they have from the prologue in Halloween till the actual events of the movie. I think we probably would have had a hard time as an audience buying a 6 or 7 year old girl as the killer. They might have been able to find a way to write around it, but I mean, they have done what, 6 or 7 Child's Play movies at this point. We buy that a doll is capable of this, but I would think that I like the idea. I kind of like the idea of it coming full circle, and having the whole thing kick off again. But I would have to imagine that part 5, in order for it to really kind of, there would need to be at least a good, like, 5 to 10 year time jump to be able to be on board with her being able to kind of pick up that mantle.
That is a good point, because I didn't think of the time jump, but I do. Yeah, I think it would have benefited, because we get these movies back to back, like in the late 80s, we get them so soon after each other that it would have been a lot. I mean, it's big shoes to fill anyway. So I think you would still have to have Michael Myers involved in some capacity, but maybe she's kind of like this person who's, because we see this like psychic connection between the two of them. So maybe she's being manipulated and it ends up killing a couple of people, but he's still doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then eventually, because it's almost like they were originally, it seemed like they were like she was going to become the next Michael Myers eventually. And that's what I always thought after watching Halloween 4. My first thought was like, oh my gosh, like how are they going to follow this up? And they just kind of ignore it, or she's still traumatized by it, but she's not doing that anymore. Like she's not going around stabbing people or anything like that. And the first kind of iteration of that screenplay for Halloween 5 by Shem Bitterman was kind of following in the footsteps of having her be like an evil, or at least be a killer to some extent. And then, and Donald Pleasance thought that made sense. So there was kind of like, I think Danielle Harris was for it. So everyone was kind of on board with it, but it eventually, the producers were saying, no, let's not go in that direction. And eventually we get kind of the other version where Jamie is still like a good character.
See, I like the idea a lot of a grown up Jamie being like Michael, you know. I like that idea. The only question or the biggest question I have, I guess, is who becomes the protagonist then?
Well, Tina.
Other than Loomis.
Well, no, seeing as they did, what's her sister's name? Is it Rachel?
Yes.
From 4?
Yep.
Rachel,
instead of doing her dirty and killing her in the first act in 5, she becomes the protagonist.
Yeah.
You know, and
perfect.
Maybe there's an element of, you know, maybe there's some kind of a gut punch ending where Jamie does wind up killing her, which I think would still have a lot more impact than just like, hey, remember this person you really liked from part 4? Yeah, we're going to just stab her with a pair of scissors and call that a day. Now let's bring in this really annoying person to kind of take her place. Enjoy.
So you're not Team Tina in this case. That's only for New Blood. Friday the 13th.
Yeah, no, if my Tina doesn't have psychic abilities, then I want no part in it.
But yeah, again, then you run into the problem, right? When you skip it, the skip ahead in the original movie, it was, like you said, it was the prologue. You know, to do that here, you would have to be catching people up and saying, well, you know, it's her, but she's grown up now. And, you know, it's a whole to do. You're re-explaining to the audience because, you know, audiences' attention spans are short, right? At least in the original Halloween, it was the prologue. So it sets up the story. I think if this what if was to happen, I think it would be a good movie, but I think the marketing campaign would be a nightmare.
And you'd almost also have to recast Jamie, right? So then Danielle might not get to be in number 5.
No, well, it would depend on how long it was until they did it. Now, if it's a year later, well, no, of course not. And if they were to even do it further down the line and still use her, again, I don't think they would be able to because, you know, she's not a very imposing person. You know,
she's pretty teeny.
She's teeny. I did a panel with her last year, and she's, you know, I'm not a tall guy, and she's you know, demure. So I think to make her terrifying would be in the Michael sense, you know, would be a pretty hard thing to pull off.
Although, like, it does present opportunities for taking things in different directions where, you know, Michael was kind of this unstoppable, I don't want to say brute, but just kind of like this force. And maybe, you know, the flavor that Jamie's version of this has is different, where she's more like stealthy or, you know, intelligent or sinister or, you know, devious, I guess. And then kind of another element, I think that would be interesting to that, where if we are bringing Rachel back as the protagonist, instead of kind of making her the Laurie Strode of the situation, she's kind of taking over the Loomis role, kind of knowing what's become of her sister.
Oh, yeah.
She's more like, no, we got to put a stop to this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I like this direction.
Now I want to see this movie. Yeah. Like, it's just upsetting me more and more thinking about what 5 actually became.
But I mean, I think they would definitely, if they didn't have Michael, they would want to have it Michael-like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Michael-esque. So if it was Jamie as a grown-up woman, I think they would, shadow Michael as much as they could, keep it very much in the same vein. Because, I mean, we're talking about, quick turnaround, quick buck movies, essentially, right? There weren't great budgets on those films. And it was the age where if your movie was a hit, you cranked up the machine as soon as possible and started putting, creatives together to get the next one in theaters for, the next year, right? That's just, how we used to roll back in the day, right? For better and worse. You know what I'm saying? So I think it probably would have ended up being in the same kind of vein, which is fine by me. I'm sure it still could have been really cool.
Yeah, it would have been interesting. I'm almost tempted to get some fan fiction going here, but I love, as someone who watched 4 and 5 a lot growing up, because AMC just seemed to air those way more than the first 2 in the franchise. I like a lot of stuff from 5, particularly I think Danielle Harris gets to do a lot more in 5, but I feel like, it would have been interesting. There's definitely a part of me that wishes they would have maybe handled some things differently or gone in a different direction. But like you said, Scott, when you got another movie to come out the next Halloween, it's kind of like, we got to fast track this and then look at things in hindsight.
You're not going to, at the end of the day, you're not going to stray, too far. Right. Unfortunately. Right. I mean, I think they did later on, certainly with, the zombie films are certainly, was separate from the original Halloween universe, just as the new ones are, So like we said, this franchise is already a whole whack of what ifs.
There's several timelines, one of which ends with Dangertainment, and we've got Cult of Thorn. It's really it's a Halloween candy grab bag. It's delightful, and mileage may vary. But,
I'll tell you what, though, like looking at it from that context, I'm really terrified now of where like Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends is going to go, because all roads have led to dead ends in all of these trajectories. You're either at Cult of Thorn, Dangertainment, like what train wreck are we going to wind up in with Halloween Ends?
I'm still dwelling on the fact that how Derek covered all of his bases by saying it's delightful. Mileage may vary.
It's like a commercial. You have to put the disclaimer in there at the end. But
it's delightful. In parentheses, may not be delightful.
May not be delightful.
Oh. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up here. This was a lot of fun, though, and I look forward to doing this episode topic again. Thank you so much. Another episode of Corpse Club comes to an end, and you've made it. We want to thank Bryan, our amazingly talented engineer, for making us sound good every episode. We really do appreciate you, Bryan. The other Bryan, as we don't want people to get confused here. And as always, we want to thank you, our listeners, including those of you who have signed up for a Corpse Club membership, and anyone who has participated in their membership by sending us questions, getting in touch with us. We love all of the engagement, so please continue doing that. Make sure to visit corpseclub.com to check out our latest episode. You can also sign up to become a member of the Corpse Club, which gets you access to all sorts of goodies. You can get pins, t-shirts, monthly bonus content, including a Night of the Lepus. Am I saying that correctly?
I don't even know anymore.
Commentary by Scott Drebit and Bryan Christopher. It's Easter themed, regardless of pronunciation. It's a very enjoyable episode. So audio commentary. So go be sure and check that out. Don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes. Every rating and review really does help. You can also find us on Google Play, SoundCloud, Pandora, YouTube, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast providers. If you want to get in touch, you can reach us anytime at contact@corpseclub.com or on Twitter at Daily Dead News or at Corpse Club, and on Instagram and Facebook under Corpse Club. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay scary.